Hello everyone, welcome to Or This. This is my video reflection upon the scriptures and the theme for this previous Sunday, which was the fourth Sunday of Advent, and that was on December 20th. The scriptures we had in worship were 2 Samuel chapter 7, verses 1 through 11 and verse 16, and then Luke's Gospel chapter 1, verses 26 through 38. And I invite you to read those, but in summary, in 2 Samuel, there is a discussion about whether God should have a house. King David had built his palace for his own home and felt that he should build God a house, since he built himself a house, and here he left God, homeless. And then, but the prophet Nathan, he has a conversation with God in which God says, "Go tell my servant David that who said that I need a house. I've been functioning perfectly fine, working and doing my thing among my people without having to be contained within four walls." But he said, of you, David, I will make a house, and of your kingdom, I will establish that kingdom and that throne forever. And then the second reading, the gospel reading, was the story of the angel Gabriel coming and telling Mary that God had chosen her to carry Jesus. And in Gabriel's speech to Mary, the angel says, this child, you will name him Jesus. He will be great. He will be called Son of the Most High. The Lord God will give to him the throne of his ancestor David. So in my sermon for this weekend, I made very little mention at all about the connection between those two scriptures with having to do with the throne of David. But the verses, and I think those scriptures were somewhat put together this week to make that connection. And so one of the things I thought about in reflection after the fact was earlier in the story of Israel's history, when they didn't have a leader they didn't have a king. They were just getting established in the promised land. They were just getting established as a cohesive group of people. They started begging God to give them a king, and God did not want to give the people a human king because they were God's people. God wanted to be their ruler. God wanted to be their leader. God wanted to lead the people and rule the people according to God's ways. And then the people would live according to God's ways and then be a light to all the nations around them, glorifying the God who was their leader. But the people wanted to be just like the other kingdoms around them, and all of the other nations around them had a king, and they wanted a king, and they wanted it badly, and they were just really insistent upon having a king so they could be like everyone else. And finally God gave in and said, okay, you'll have a king. So God's people were given a king, starting with Saul, then King David, then King Solomon. And so we have the story of King David in today's gospel or in today's scriptures. But after Solomon, who was David's son, there was a division in God's people, and they were divided into two kingdoms, so to speak, Israel and Judah. And the kings of Israel and Judah, let's just say, so Judah would have continued David's line, David's ancestors, or David's descendants on the throne. Israel ended up being others. But these kings caused a lot of strife and difficulty for God's people that they ruled. Israel was just a hot mess, to be honest. After Solomon, those kings, there was really never a good king for Israel. The kings of Judah, if you go along, there might be 2 or 3 good kings who tried to reestablish God's people following God's ways, but a majority of the kings were bad. They they oppressed the people, or they led them astray to worship other gods. They did not care for the people, and so there were people who would end up in poverty and struggle, and they would have difficult relationships with the kingdoms around them, and they just weren't good leaders. And then came the Babylonian exile, where Babylon came in and destroyed the temple and conquered the land, conquered God's people, and ruled over them, and sent many of the higher level of society of God's people into exile. So that was God's people's experience with kings. It was basically what God expected, that putting human kings into power is going to be challenging, because power goes to the heads of human beings. And then human beings get their own ideas about what they should do, and they have all the power to do whatever they want, and they do that and forget about God. That's what happens throughout much of the story of God's people in the Old Testament. Then we get to Luke, and we get to this announcement of the angel to Mary that she will have a son, name him Jesus, and God will give him the throne of his ancestor David. So Jesus is being established here as a king in the line of David, so continuing God's promise of David's line being king forever. But what's more interesting is Jesus is the Word made flesh. Jesus is God with us. We believe that Jesus is God coming into the world. And so Jesus being called king is basically God coming into the world to show how God's rule, how God's kingdom functions, what God's kingdom looks like. And it is going to look different from the way that the ancient kingdom of Israel and Judah functioned, the way their kings functioned. This is going to look very different. And here lies some of the confusion during Jesus' ministry. But it's just I just thought it was really interesting. So what does it mean when we call Jesus king? When we talk about Jesus being king, it means that through Jesus, we got to see how God's kingdom functions in relationship to humanity. And what was that kingdom? It was a kingdom that cared for those who were left out in society. It was a kingdom that spent its time with those who were weakest, who didn't matter in the eyes of the powerful human beings of the world. It was a kingdom that brought God's presence among those who were considered the least in the society. And then it was a kingdom that would not use violence, not like other kingdoms in the world who would use violence against each other to grab power. But Jesus as king never grabbed power. Instead, he humbled himself to the point of death. So, when we think about Jesus coming into this world, being born into this world, and Jesus being king, and Jesus being God, we learn a whole lot about God's ways and God's presence among us. And that's what it means to recognize Jesus as king. Not only that he has authority over our lives, but that he shows us what God's kingdom values, how God's kingdom functions in this world. And it is drastically different from the ways that other kingdoms of this world function. It doesn't grab power. It doesn't spend most of its time with the most popular and the most wealthy and the most powerful. Instead, its power is demonstrated in weakness, in lifting up the lowly. So, those are my thoughts. Went on a little bit longer today than I have in the past. Took a little bit of time for the explanation of Kings, but I hope that this was meaningful to you. And I would love to hear any of your comments, either on the sermon or on what I said here in the comment section on YouTube or on Facebook. Thank you all for tuning in. God bless.